What kind of people invent a punishment where your lungs are pulled out and then draped over your shoulders like wings? Meet the Vikings. Not the helmet-wearing, horn-blasting cartoon characters you're used to, but real, living, breathing men who plundered, prayed, and occasionally, when someone really made them mad, performed a ritual execution so brutal it still shocks historians. They called it the Blood Eagle. And yes, it's as awful as it sounds. But to understand why anyone would do this, or how it even worked, you have to leave behind the modern world, with its stainless steel prisons and carefully worded legal system, and step into the 9th century Norse mindset, a world where honor could mean everything, where revenge was a sacred duty, and where showing weakness was basically a death sentence. So let's go back. It's dusk on a rocky coastline in what is now Norway. The wind tastes like iron and salt. A warship has just landed, long, sleek, carved with dragon heads, painted with tar and red pigment. 20 men step off, axes slung over their backs, not in formation, but in silent understanding. These are not conquerors today, not raiders. Today they are judges. And the man they've come for is already tied to the post. His name might have been Ella, or Halfdan, or maybe something lost to time. But the sagas suggest he was a king who betrayed another Viking, maybe killed a nobleman, or failed to pay blood money, or committed treason. The records aren't clear. What is clear is this: he was about to be made an example. Here's how the Blood Eagle supposedly worked. First, the victim was tied, face down or kneeling, to a large flat rock or wooden frame. The executioner, sometimes a warrior, sometimes a close relative of the one who'd been wronged, would take a knife and make 2 deep incisions along either side of the spine, from the base of the rib cage to the shoulders, cutting through skin, fat, and muscle. Then, with a sea axe, a kind of Viking short sword, they would slowly break each rib away from the spine, one by one, pulling them outward to create an opening. Picture unzipping the entire rib cage and peeling it back like the pages of a... Once the ribs were spread wide enough, the lungs were pulled out, yes, still attached, and laid gently across the victim's shoulder. And here's the part that makes historians pause. Supposedly, the person was still alive when it happened. Now, modern science throws some doubt on that. Could a person really survive that long through blood loss and shock? Maybe not, but the sagas are clear in their intention. The person was meant to feel it, to know it, to suffer, because that was the point. This wasn't just execution, it was spectacle, punishment as theater. And for the Vikings, that mattered. You see, in Norse society, the worst thing you could be wasn't poor, or weak, or even dead. It was dishonored. Reputation was everything. What people said about you at feasts, how your name was sung in the halls, whether the skalds, the Viking poets, remembered you as a fearless fighter or a coward who died whimpering in the snow. So when someone broke the social code, killed a kinsman, betrayed their host, disrespected the gods, it wasn't enough just to end their life. Their death had to be a warning. According to one saga, the Blood Eagle was reserved for the worst kind of traitors. It wasn't used often, maybe only once or twice in the whole record, but when it was unforgettable. The Icelandic saga of Orkneyinga mentions it. So does Norna Gest's Thattur, a tale from the 13th century. And in one of the most famous accounts, the Blood Eagle is performed on King Illa of Northumbria, the same man who killed the legendary Viking warrior Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the saga, Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, swore revenge. And when they finally captured Ella, they didn't just kill him, they gave him the Blood Eagle. And when they were done, they salted his wounds. Yes, salted. As if the mutilation weren't enough, they poured salt into the exposed muscle and bone to preserve the moment, to make the pain last. Some historians think this whole thing was poetic metaphor, a story turned into allegory. Others say, no, Vikings were fully capable of this. They had the tools, the brutality, and the motivation, because the Blood Eagle didn't just kill a person, it rewrote them. Imagine being a Viking child, hearing this story in the flickering firelight. Imagine being a rival warlord, thinking of betraying a peace treaty. Imagine being a prisoner and knowing this fate was not just possible, but sanctioned. This was cultural power. And for a society with no police, no prisons, no courtrooms, where justice often came at the edge of a sword, it worked. Punishment had to be public, pain had to be personal, and suffering had to be memorable. And here's the irony. The Vikings didn't think of this as cruel. They thought of it as necessary. You might be thinking, how could anyone do this and still go home to their family? But remember, this is a society where the line between justice and revenge was paper thin, where killing someone for dishonoring your father wasn't just allowed, it was expected. And in that world, the blood eagle was the nuclear option, a punishment so extreme it wasn't used lightly. But when it was, it became legend. By the end of the first night, the executioner would be washing the blood from their arms in a stream. The lungs would be discarded or burned, the body left out as a warning, sometimes nailed to it, other time, and when the people passed, they would whisper, not just about the pain, but about what it meant. Don't cross that man. Don't dishonor that family. Don't become the next eagle. Because in a culture that feared shame more than death, that was the worst possible ending. To die screaming, lungs splayed as your enemies watched in silence. That was the legacy of the blood eagle. And it wasn't just about one king or one traitor or one family's vengeance. It was about sending a message that would echo across generations. By the time the blood had dried on the rock, the story had already started. Not just through the village, not just through the fjords, but across the sea, from fire-lit longhouses to rival courts in Ireland, Scotland, the Frankish coast. Whispers of a king who had his ribs cracked open like firewood. A message carved not into stone, but into memory. And if the first section of this story showed you the how, then this part is about the why. Why violence like this was not only permitted, but performed with almost ceremonial pride. Because Viking society, brutal as it could be, wasn't chaotic. It wasn't lawless. In fact, it was full of laws, just not the kind enforced by cops or courts. Their justice came with spears and songs, oaths and blood feud. And if someone killed your brother, you didn't cry, you didn't forgive, you demanded a price. That price was called wergild, literally man money, a fixed amount you had to pay if you wronged someone. Kill a thrall, a lowly slave, not too expensive. Kill a free man, significantly more. Kill a noble, you'd better be ready for war. Unless, of course, you paid the blood price with treasure or flesh. That's where the blood eagle came in. It wasn't just about pain, it was about balance. Because if your family member had died, not in battle, not in drunken accident, but betrayed, ambushed, dishonored, then the only way to level the scales was to make the other family feel, not quietly, not with poison in the night, but publicly, grotesquely, in a way that could never be forgotten. And sometimes, that meant the ritual death of a man who symbolized that crime. One saga describes a Viking named Torf Einar, who captured the killer of his father. Did he kill him on the spot? No. He built a platform, invited witnesses, and performed the blood eagle in front of the village. It wasn't murder, it was performance. Justice by agony. But even the men performing it had to follow rules. You couldn't just start slicing into someone's back because you were in a bad mood. There had to be witnesses, there had to be a claim, there had to be proof, or at least the appearance of it. Viking law required an assembly, called the Thing, a gathering of freemen who would hear disputes, settle quarrels, declare judgments. If the verdict was death, then the method was left to the family. And if the crime was great enough, the blood eagle could be approved. Yes, even something that horrifying had legal structure. It's one of the strangest contradictions in Viking life. They were ferocious raiders, yes, but at home, they were obsessed with fairness, reputation, and ritual. A man who killed unjustly could be declared Nidingur, a person without honor, someone outside the law, a walking curse. A man no longer considered human, which meant anyone could kill him. No penalty, no trial, just a sword to the gut. But let's pause here, because there's something else about this punishment that's easy to miss: the emotional calculation. Imagine you're a Viking son. Your father was murdered by a rival chief. The law gives you two options: accept wergild, payment in silver, weapons, livestock, or demand blood, and the community is watching. If you accept the money, maybe you secure peace. Your family eat, no one else dies. But people might say you were soft. If you demand blood, then the killing doesn't stop. Then it's a feud. You execute their leader, maybe by blood eagle. They retaliate. Sons for sons, brothers for brothers. Now you're both ruined, but no one calls you a coward. These were the choices people had to make, not between right and wrong, but between survival and pride. And more often than not, pride won. The blood eagle wasn't just about the victim, it was a mirror for the community. It forced everyone to confront the price of justice, to ask, is this what vengeance looks like? Is this what it costs? And the strange thing? People respected it, the same way a modern courtroom might respect a long, painful trial. The sagas respected a well-executed punishment. One story even describes how a dying man, mid-execution, shouted insults at it. Why? Because dying with courage mattered more than living with shame. It was the Viking equivalent of giving your executioner the middle finger. They believed that if you died badly, screaming, crying, begging, your name would be cursed. You wouldn't reach Valhalla. The gates would close. But if you died like a warrior, chest out, lungs heaving, even while being torn apart, then maybe, just maybe, the gods would smile. So who were the people watching? Not just enemies, friends, wives, children. Punishments like this weren't hidden away. They were community events. The same people who gathered for marriages, harvests, and births also gathered for deaths. Not because they were bloodthirsty, but because it mattered to see justice done. To them, violence was educational. It taught lessons. It warned others. It showed the next generation how to live and how to die. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth, that in the eyes of these people, ripping someone's chest open wasn't evil. It was noble. Of course, not every Viking thought this way. There were pacifists, healers, wise women who counseled, chieftains who tried diplomacy before drawing swords. But in the sagas, the stories that survived, the blood eagle became legend. And like all legends, it grew. Some scholars believe it was never actually done, that it was just a metaphor for total revenge. But even if it was only imagined, that tells us something powerful. Because what kind of society imagines this? What kind of mind thinks up a punishment so vivid, so grotesque, that we're still talking about it over 1,000 years later? Whether it was real or symbolic, the blood eagle became something larger than pain. It became proof. Proof that Viking vengeance didn't stop with death. It kept going until every rib cracked, until every lung screamed, until every witness looked away. By now, you understand that the blood eagle wasn't just a method of execution. It was a statement, a deeply personal letter, carved into skin and bone, addressed to anyone who might dare cross the wrong man at the wrong time. But what did that message actually look like? Let's walk through it, not as morbid voyeurs, but as historians. Not to revel in the gore, but to understand what it meant for the people who lived it. It started strangely with the condemned man would be stripped naked and bound, hands and feet tied so tightly his skin purpled, not with rope, but with cords made of twisted hide, wet when applied, drying to shrink. The effect was slow suffocation even before the main event began. Next came the incision, a clean cut down the back, from the nape of the neck to the small of the spine. Not fast, not wild, done with the kind of precision you don't expect in an era before anesthesia or surgical training. It took a kind of craftsmanship, and yes, some of them considered it just that. The sagas describe how the ribs were carefully broken from the spine, one by one, and pulled outward like wings. The lungs were then dragged from the chest cavity and laid across the exposed ribs. This, according to the accounts, made the victim look like they had wings. Eagle wings. But it wasn't just the shape that mattered, it was the symbolism. In Norse mythology, the eagle represented death, air, spirit, the divine. Odin, chief of the gods, had 2 ravens and a wolf, but it was the eagle who circled the battlefield, carrying the fallen to Valhalla. The blood eagle was, in some gruesome way, a form of spiritual sarcasm. They weren't giving you wings to fly. They were tearing them out to mock your soul. Of course, we don't know if the victim always died immediately. That's one of the most debated points. Some say the procedure was survivable for a few minutes, long enough perhaps for the victim to scream, to curse, to weep, to spit one last insult. Others insist the shock alone would kill within seconds. But whether death came quickly or not, the memory stayed. One 9th century tale speaks of King Illa of Northumbria, captured by Ragnar Lothbrok's sons. They accused him of murdering their father, and when they caught him, they made a public spectacle of him, performed the blood eagle, not in secret, but as theater. They chanted, they sang, they recited poems of vengeance as his back was opened and his lungs lifted to the sky. It wasn't enough to kill. They had to tell his story and retell it and sing it until the bones became legend. And then there's the question no one likes to ask. Who did the cutting? Not just any warrior, not some faceless executioner. It was often a son, a brother, a chieftain himself, someone with a personal stake in the revenge. This wasn't outsourced violence, it was intimate. To perform a blood eagle was to touch your enemy's bones, to look him in the eye, to show him that you, not fate, not the gods, were the hand that would unmake him. And the act changed you. There's evidence in Viking poetry of warriors haunted by the faces of the dying, of dreams that smelled like burning meat and felt like slicing fat, because even the boldest men couldn't fully escape the cost of such violence. Justice or not, the image stayed in their minds. And perhaps that was part of the point. The blood eagle wasn't meant to make anyone feel good. It was meant to burn itself into memory. Let's talk logistics. Could they have actually done this? Was the technique even possible with the tool? Surprisingly, yes. Vikings had blades sharp enough to split hair. Their blacksmiths forged weapons that could cleave bone, armor, even shields. If someone was skilled with a sea axe, a single-edged Viking knife, they could easily separate muscle from spine. Not fast, but possible. And if the executioner had served time in war, seen real carnage, then the act wouldn't have been totally unfamiliar. In fact, some modern historians believe certain Viking healers were trained in anatomy well enough to avoid major. They knew how to cut and how not to. Still, the question isn't just, can they? It's why they'd want to. And that brings us back to legacy. Because once it was done, the body wasn't buried right away. It was left on a rock, on a hill, in a clearing where the community could see it, sometimes for days. Birds would come, wolves too. The smell would travel, but no one moved it, not until the message had been received. And in that sense, the blood eagle was closer to a public monument than a murder, a warning carved in flesh instead of stone. You didn't need to speak the language to understand the open chest, the flayed skin, the lungs rising in the cold. This was what happened when honor was broken. This was what happened when you crossed family. But there's a darker twist here. As much as the blood eagle terrified others, it also elevated the victim, in a way. Because if someone was important enough to be executed this way, then their name would live. They'd be feared, even in death. And for a Viking warrior, that meant something. It meant they were worthy. So even as their body was torn apart, their reputation grew, a paradox of pain. Of course, this ritual didn't last forever. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, customs like the blood eagle were pushed underground or erased altogether. The new gods didn't tolerate old punishment. Public torture became sin. Execution became quiet. But the stories, those remained, preserved in sagas, etched into memory, shared by firelight long after the rituals, because humans forget laws, but we never forget spectacle. And so we're left with this image, a quiet hilltop, a broken body. A people who believed, with absolute certainty, that justice didn't come from mercy. It came from making sure everyone remembered. You'd think something like the blood eagle would disappear quietly into the shadows of an uncomfortable footnote, a maybe it happened, maybe it didn't sort of thing. But no, it refuses to go away. Not because we want it to be true, but because deep down, we suspect it might be. It's the kind of punishment that feels too theatrical to invent, too cruel to forget, and too specific to ignore. A final act of revenge that only makes sense in a world where justice is personal, not procedural, where law lives not in courts, but in memory. And make no mistake, memory was power in the Viking world. If people feared you after death, they respected you in life. That's why even the possibility of the blood eagle was enough to keep enemies in line. Why Viking skalds, poets of war and blood, kept describing it centuries after it may have vanished from practice. Not because it was common, but because it worked, because people talked about it, because people shuddered when they did. But let's step out of the sagas for a moment. Let's imagine a night in early winter, sometime around the year 875, in the cold hills of Norway. The air is thin, your fire is low. Someone, a grandfather maybe, starts telling a story about a man named Ila, about Ragnar's sons, about the eagle carved from inside. And everyone leans closer, even the grown men. They don't ask if it's real, they just listen. Because whether or not the blood eagle ever happened exactly the way the poets said, it meant something. It shaped behavior. It haunted dreams. It warned kings and traitors alike that some wounds aren't meant to heal. And sometimes, the most terrifying part of a punishment isn't the pain, it's the meaning behind it. That's what made the blood eagle unforgettable. It wasn't random, it was personal. Modern historians still argue over it. Some think it was exaggerated or mistranslated, poetic license mistaken for fact. They point to linguistic quirks, missing context, or medieval Christian authors who might have wanted to make the pagans look extra barbaric. But even those skeptics have to admit something uncomfortable. Someone, somewhere, believed it enough to write it down, and others believed it enough to remember. That alone gives it power. And when something has power in the memory of a culture, even if it's half myth, it shapes behavior like law never could. Because if your ancestors thought you could be ripped open, lungs displayed like wings, and your name cursed for generations, you might think twice before betraying your kin. You might honor the pact, respect the line, choose loyalty over ambition.
You might remember. And here's where it starts to feel familiar, more than we'd like to admit. No, we don't flay our enemies anymore, at least not in public. We've replaced bone with bureaucracy, sword with subpoena, but the instinct remains. We still believe some betrayals demand a spectacle. We still drag reputations through the street, burn names in headlines, demand apologies carved into metaphorical flesh. We still want justice to be seen, not just done. It's why public disgrace still feels like execution. Why we can ruin someone's life with a story, a video, a single viral moment. Because part of us still believes in the blood eagle. We just perform it differently now. We let memory, not metal, do the cutting. So no, the blood eagle probably didn't happen the way the sagas say. Not every rib, not every lung, but it did happen. In the minds of the people who feared it, who passed the story down, who taught their children to obey the codes of honor lest they become the next cautionary tale. That's the real legacy of this ritual. Not the pain, the reminder that in some places, your punishment isn't over when you die. It lives in the stories told after you're gone. Because sometimes the sharpest blade is memory.